For this week's Shop Talk segment, I am hanging with my friend Steve Stecker over at Doc Sweeney Drums. They just released a brand new snare drum design. Pretty innovative. I don't know that anything like this has ever existed before. I've certainly never seen it. They're calling it the HolloCore. I'm just going to read the press release so I don't get any of the details wrong. But this is a pretty awesome new innovation. So HolloCore series snares. The hypothesis was a HolloCore shell will produce a more resonant and fat-sounding snare drum. That's what Steve envisioned, and then they sought to design this. So the design consists of a solid batter and resonant bearing edge sections with a hollow core made of thin internal and external walls that slip into joints on the bearing edge sections. They audio tested several variants of the design, including different bearing edges, shell thicknesses, lug layouts, and species. And the outcome of those tests was the new HolloCore series snare. Its specs is a 14-inch drum, 6.5 inches deep, with a 3/4 of an inch thick maple stave shell with 30-degree rounded bearing edges. There are inlays that are the connecting points between the HolloCore and the solid bearing edges. They're using modern tube lugs that are mounted on the top and bottom inlays. Die-cast hoops, but they will also offer 3mm triple flange. They come with an Aquarian Super Tube batter and a classic clear snare side head, an Indy strainer, 16-strand wires, a hand-rubbed oil finish, and they have some just suggestions for tuning and all that. But I got one into the studio here to test. I took it over and to the big room and did a bunch of tuning tests from what I would think of medium high all the way down to super low. We'll drop that in at the end of the interview. But I wanted to pick Steve's brain about, how did this come to be, go from a thought of an idea through all the testing, and then how they kind of settled on each of these components. So it's all very specifically chosen. So why 16-strand wires? Why die-cast hoops? All that stuff. So let's get to it with Steven Stecker of Doc Sweeney Drums on the new HolloCore series snare. What's new with you?
I'm just recovering I had a total hip replacement in August.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So I was actually up and walking the same day of the surgery. And then 4 days later, I was in the studio working on drums.
Oh,
but it was somewhat uncomfortable, to say the least. now I'm back up. It's so much better than it was pre-surgery because it was so painful just living with a bad back. And now, I feel 10 years younger and look 15 years older.
Well, you can even those out eventually, I
guess. Yeah. But no, it's actually great. And I've had a ton of things in design, the HolloCore being one. And we had spent the last roughly 9 months doing all kinds of testing and research into it. I came up with this concept of the hollow body. Thinking of hollow body guitars, come up, well, can we do it? And if we do it, what are going to be the tonal implications of trying to hollow out a core, going with the assumption that I was going to create a punchy, fat sound just by lowering the mass of the shell itself and creating these really thick bearing edges, which are going to hug the hoops and the heads. So getting more control. And, we tested different thicknesses. We started at a half, we went to 3/4, we tried different bearing edges and all kinds of things. And the result, we really felt good. We tested it in the studios in Nashville and down here in SoCal. And so after several iterations, and I think we tried 10 different batter heads and combos. We finally came up with the version that we like. And that's the one I sent to you. Mm-hmm. Also working on, which you'll see soon, is a lugless drums kit.
What?
Yeah. As a matter of fact, I'll show you. I don't know if this will work, but can you see it?
Oh, yeah. It looks like an unfinished drum set.
Yeah, it's a finished drum set. It has no lugs. The spurs are actually built into the hoops, and the tom brackets for the floor toms are built into the hoops, so there's no tom brackets. The strainer actually sits on a hoop as well, so the strainer, nothing's drilled into it. They're the most resonant things we've ever built. We actually handmade those aluminum components. We're now finding, I mean, it was a lot of machining and CNC, but they sound really good. That'll be the next crazy dock thing you'll see in about a month. But I just been in the, being the mad scientist and testing out all these different theories, and really, really stoked with the HolloCore, because it's just much more feasible to produce on a mass production basis, where these one-off kind of interesting lugless drum concepts would take a lot more and be able to mass produce them. We have the patent pending for the technology that we put together, and they sound tremendous, but it's just a matter of, do we have to go offshore to have these aluminum super rings made, or can we find somewhere in, Keokuk, Iowa, or Pennsylvania, or somewhere other than California, to have those parts made? And if we do, then you'll see more of those. But that'd probably be the next thing on your hit parade to take a test drive on. I think it'll blow your mind. The actual spurs snap. They're spring loaded, so when you want to snap them back, they snap right into the hoop and total circle. You just load them in the bag and you're off and running, so you don't have to put anything on. It's really, really a resonant drum set. I mean, they just went. That's kind of fun, and we're doing all kinds of different exotic species that I've run across. So, it's been the busiest year we've ever had.
That's good.
We've been shipping a ton of stuff to Canada, a ton of stuff to Europe, into Asia. So, we're in Holland, and we're in Switzerland, and we've been in France, and now we're in several countries in Asia. So, I don't know, it's gone from this Doc and I's little party activity, as retired people, and it's kind of just picked up pace, which is cool. We're still young enough to do it for a while and then hand off the reins to someone else, because with all this money I've invented in patents and invested in patents and everything, someone ought to take over. It's not going to be my kids. They're law degrees and other things. They're like fucking drums, There's no money in it. Yeah, there's no money in it, that kind of thing. I'm like, well, yeah, there's not a lot in it, that's for sure. But yeah, it's just kind of always looking for a sound, always testing the boundaries. I've got another wild thing in my head that I dreamt up last night, which will be a whole different bearing edge setup. And I'll elaborate a little bit more later. I'll send you some pics, but it's along the lines of some of the I think they're called flanger snares from the 20s and 30s, where they had this brass piece that went in the middle of the drum, right underneath the bearing edges. I was thinking we could do something like that in wood and just see how the sound comes out. And then we test it with different portholes in it. We're also testing what we would do if we enlarged some sound ports in the current HolloCore as well. So having a smaller to the exterior, but having bigger portholes and seeing what kind of sound that produces. So those are things on the horizon.
Wow. You're not even celebrating the HolloCore. You're right on to the next thing.
Yeah, well, because I've been working on it so long, and we did the videos and we've tested. I've lived with it so long. We're now got it down to where we can mass produce it, and I don't have to handle every single one of them. The team will be doing that. And the CNC, basically, the shells, we do a CNC machine. So everything's milled to perfect dimensions, ODs and IDs, internal and outer dimensions, diameters. And so, once you get it down to where you can make these things with a CNC pretty quickly, the only thing that adds is the gluing and finishing. But, being able to produce these maple, we're also going to do walnut. We have done walnut. So there'll be two, they'll be really standardized. We have the little bridge, which the strainer hooks to. So all of those components are now readily available in mass quantities, and we'll be shipping them directly from, the production line. So we're going to be driving down the cost of them as we get more efficient and economies of scale. But it's something that I think can compete with most of the custom builders and some of the higher end stuff that comes out of DW with this unique, patent pending concept. Where does it go from here? Well, we want to get those out and do it in a big way, introduce them, get them around. We're actually having an event this weekend at all of our major distributors called the Doc Sweeney Founders Celebration, and there'll be HolloCores at most of those locations. There's a big batch coming in this week, so they'll be going out and be in the hands of all the distributors that, including in Europe. So they'll get some exposure that way. And it's just great that October 7th just happens to be the first day of the launch of the weekend. So, yeah, we're pretty stoked about that. So,
but take me back to the design. I mean, the hypothesis, and
sure.
Were you completely satisfied, or did you have to make some drastic changes as you were developing it?
We made some significant alterations. The whole concept was just based on the hollow body guitar. And as I started drawing it up and doing some CAD/CAM, just trying to figure out what dimensions would really work and what dimensions are required to get the sound effect that I was looking for, so that, for lack of better terms, that hollow a wider, deeper, fat sound. And so we started with only a half an inch thick, and the void, which is the open space, just wasn't big enough to create what I wanted in terms of that real deep, fat sound with some punch to it. And so we continued to go out. We went to 5/8 and then went to 3/4. 3/4 was the sweet spot, and that's where we started. We ended on 3/4 of an inch thick. That allowed us to do some special things with the bearing edge. So we started with 45 rounded, and it was really ringy and didn't sound good at all. And we went to 30-degree rounded, sounded better, but not exactly where I wanted it. And then we went to 30 super rounded. That's 3/4 of an inch thick. And that just seemed to be right in the space. We then had a battle between 3mm triple flange and die-cast tubes. Both are definitely usable on it, but when we came up with the idea, let's get a drum out there where it can be fat and tuned at multiple levels and not have to have a lot of muting or muffling going on. Let the drum do all the work. And that, with the die-cast, gave it the most control. And in some instances, it might be too much control. Therefore, we've got the backup, which is 3mm triple flange, which gives you still that fat sound, but it allows you to do a little more openness for those that want a much more open higher end. A higher end in any of these drums tends to be a little bit choked off the higher you go, but you throw a triple flange on and you extend that range quite a bit. So that was the biggest thing. Like I said, 9 months worth of design iterations, and we put more effort into this than anything else we've done in terms of a snare drum offering. So we're really pleased with the results. We had it in the hands of some studio people. So we'll let a number of doc artists and other studio people mess with it and play with it and record with it and send us their files and their feedback. And that was all taken into consideration when we finally got to the modern, the HolloCore that you see today.
Why 16-strand wires? Did you mess with different options?
Yes, that's another thing we did. We went the full gambit. We went from 16, 20, 24, 25 from one user, and 30. And what we got down to is we felt that of all of the different tests that we ran on all those different strand varieties, that 16 gave us enough of the snare sound, the sizzle, if you will, and that was just in the right kind of sound that we were looking for. So it was letting more of the drum and that fatness of the drum come out than, for example, with 30 strand, you're getting a heck of a lot of snare buzz and some sympathetic snare sound as well, like just with so many wires. So we just thought, if you were going to want to hear the tone and the sound of the wood and the drum itself, we go with the 16, which still gives you a nice sizzle, but it's not overwhelming in sound. So yeah, that was tested. Those varieties were all part of the various iterations and testings and recordings.
Do you have a favorite tuning for this drum? I tested it from medium high down to as low as it can go, and it was all great. So do you have a spot that you think is ideal for it?
Yeah, the spot ideal for it is, we think that with the Reso side, about a medium tuning. So not really cranked up, not really low. Medium tuning gives you much more versatility with battered tuning. We think that in the deep and mid areas, it performs quite well. Those that intend to use it for some more of the high-end crack with punch and would most likely go with the triple flange, 3 mil triple flange, and or possibly a different head. We thought that the head, being a very thin 2-ply, gave us the best kind of response and didn't over control the drum. So for example, Evans an HD generic dryer, or even a Power Stroke 3, or all the different versions of controlled snare heads. We felt that we didn't want it that controlled. We wanted to leave it open, and we wanted it was most likely going to be a drum that a lot of power hitters are going to use, and therefore we thought the 2-ply was a good option. And we think that the Super 2 Aquarian gives it quite a wider tuning range than if you go with a certain control head, which when you get up in the high, it really becomes just absolutely dried out. So we think that the right head combo's there. But yeah, I think people will crank it up even with the current structure, the current head and hoop combo, and really like it. But it's just drier than my tastes. Like just a little bit more of it opened up, and that's easily handled by changing heads.
Now, is there any? I'm thinking of what would be the concerns for a customer? Any potential risk of this shell not holding its form over time because there's a big space in it?
Yeah, no. That is also been part of a lot of the testing and moving stuff around. Because it is actually sitting, the inner components, the inner walls, if you will, the hollow core, rest on a large computer generated milled, if you will, edges where there's a fairly substantial joint that goes into both the top and bottom. So where it touches the solid top and bottom bearing edge parts, which are 3/4 of an inch thick, very, very sturdy, there is that joint, and it's as sturdy as the rest of the drum. It will never rot around unless you run it over with your car, or have someone that's really big stand on it. But it might even pass that test. But yeah, we're very confident in the structure, the rigidity and stability of the shell itself.
Now, is it 8 lugs? I've got it here. I should have counted, or is it 10?
It's 8 lugs.
8 lug. Did you mess with 10 lug options, or did you?
Yeah, right we did. We did 8 and 10, and we once again, after all of the testing and playing in the studios and letting a bunch of different drummers, studio people, tune it and test it, the consensus was at the end of the day that the 8 lug allowed them to control the drum, without any trouble, and allowed them to tune it. They felt very effectively with 8, and the 10. It's fine. It's just a little more controlled, but really it was unanimous of all the testers that the 8 lug just opened it up a little bit more and gave it that really deep, fat gudge kind of sound that that our original intent is to have a big, fat throated drum, and 8 lug helps that. 10 lug, as a matter of fact, 8 lug with the diecast really is a fat, controlled sound, not overly controlled, I think.
What do you do with all these test drums that don't make the cut?
I donate quite a few of them. We have Drummers Without Borders here in San Diego, SoCal, and I donate quite a bit of equipment to them, unbadge it and donate it to them. And so that's a really good thing. And to some folks that really wanted more of an open sound, some of the, if you will, prototypes will find their way to dock artists, and they'll use them in different capacities. So yeah, there's nothing, as my mom would say, well, you'll have fancy firewood, otherwise, yeah, big supporter. No, actually she is, but yeah, I think we try to find homes for all of this stuff. And whether it's donating it to schools, that's fine. They're not going to sit around here in my studio because I always put more junk in right behind it. Something new's got to happen right behind it, right?
Have you ever messed with 6 lugs?
What's that?
You ever messed with 6 lug drums?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I have. Made a couple steam bent maple 6 lug drums. And I thought they were great. They sold right away. I thought they were really good, but that's kind of one of those things where people are really leery that, the 10 lugs is the thing to do with your snare, 10 lug. And I go, well, look back at some of these student models from the 40s and 50s and 60s and some other models that are only 6 lugs, really open, really cool jazz soundy things. And yeah, we've made them, but there just really hasn't been much of a, demand for it. So, I probably will make another one, but the ones we did make, we knew the types of individuals that would go after them. And they were more of a kind of the jazz performance type of thing, where it was, just a really open sound for brushes and everything else. It sounds really good that way.
You mentioned you did a walnut version. Are you going to do any other sizes, like an 8-inch deep or a shallower drum or different diameters?
Initially, in the initial production batches, which are a couple of batches, a couple of tranches that are underway, they're all going to be 14 by 6.5 just to maintain standard and get up in economies of scale. We definitely are going to go to an 8-inch deep one that we'll probably call the super fat HolloCore or something, but that will be a monster. What I'm also going to do is make a couple toms the same way. So ultimately, I'll make we're going to make a test kit using that same concept for everything. But yeah, we're definitely going to go deeper. I think going shallow is not really feasible because you end up having a space that's hollow that's just negligible. I mean, would be 1.5 inches or an inch, and that's really not going to accomplish anything. It'll sound just like a solid snare, I think. At least theoretically, it would sound less different. But going to an 8-inch depth snare with this concept just gives you that much bigger void, and it's going to give you a much lower end punchy sound. And we're definitely got that on the hit parade. That's going to be out before the holiday season. So I have to put a bow on one and send it to Pittsburgh.
I mean, the kit, that sounds crazy. That kick drum will be like sub
Yeah, it'll be thunderous. Yeah, well, it won't need much. I mean, you won't need much more than that. I don't know if you'll even have to mic it. It'll be pretty loud,
Wow. I mean, I thank you for sending me the drum. I had a lot of fun messing with it. I compared it to four other drums. I had a solid single ply maple. I had the red oak that from you guys. I had a vintage style 3-ply with a big poplar core, and a 12-ply maple. And when I tuned them all up identically, as best as I could, it was closest in timbre to the 3-ply, surprisingly, than the solid maple. Like there was an openness to it that was like, oh, it's a little bit more in that world, but then it had just a lot more sound to it.
Yeah, I think it's the combination of the big mass at the actual striking area. So you've got a pretty significant mass there at 3/4 of an inch thick, right? And roughly 1.5 inches deep. So you're hitting a pretty solid, and then the energy goes from the head into that solid part, but then it goes and migrates into 2 thinner inner walls, allowing it to really resonate. So it creates this chamber, which makes it kind of deeper and fatter sounding. So it would be much more akin to a 3-ply because the actual size, if it was 3/4 of an inch solid, it would be so loud. It would be much more like a steam vent drum that's 5/16, but just screamingly loud. So we think, that combination allows it to be a little more powerful, I think, and punchy than just a stripped 3-ply. And I think it's just some of the mass behind it, as well as a fairly substantial void around the roughly 46 inches in circumference, 43, 44 inches.
So if I had this drum as like my centerpiece for my studio, what would be the next complementary snare drum that you offer that would give me, the contrast to this? Right.
I think the next one would be, as a matter of fact, I'm working on it now. I'll see if I can hold it up for you.
Oh,
this is solid. This is a 1/2 inch thick, solid maple, and in this case, figured burl maple. It's 14 by 4, 1/2 inch thick, and it really it'll take the paint off your walls. It really, it's extremely articulate, but the crack, that drum's called crack, but it really does have. So whether it's a side snare or something you want, just to have there for mad accents, that's one really good option. I do think we're running a bunch of elms as well, elm drums. Elm, steam bent elm, so 5/16 of an inch thick, very warm, and I think one of the best tonal woods that we work with would be mellower than the HolloCore. So warm, very warm and mellow, and then that one that you just saw, for someone that wanted something with a lot of staccato, a lot of crack. But believe it or not, it's only 4 inches deep, but it can be tuned way down as well. So you can get some really interesting range out of that drum, up to sounding like you're hitting concrete with snare wires under it.
Is that a stave shell or a steam bent?
Yeah, that's a stave shell. We're going to do it in both versions, but in this case, we went with a 1/2 inch thick because first of all, the board was fantastic that I found, and I said I got to make a drum out of it. And so when we did it, and it just came out sounding great. So we'll be doing a lot of 1/2 inch thick stave, and we'll be doing the standard same bearing edges, but steam bent. It just really, really, really sounds good to me. And of course, we generally, with more of the piccolo size, we tend to go with Babinga or maple, something that really is going to have some punch. I mean, some really high end crack and versatility, as opposed to try to make it out of mahogany, which wouldn't really make much sense. Yeah. I mean, it'd be kind of a weak firecracker.
All right, so recap that. That's a 4 inch deep stave maple.
Yep.
And then the HolloCore is
6.5
stave maple with the big chamber in it. What would
Correct.
be the dimensions of the elm that you would add into the mix?
The elm, we're doing it in two sizes, 14 by 5.5 and 14 by 6.5. All elm, so elm rings and elm. That we think is just a tremendous tonal wood. Gives you the warmth and kind of the vintage sound of mahogany in a domestic species, and just we think that it provides a really wide tuning range, wider than you would think, given how it's not a dense hardwood. So you would think it would struggle with high ends, but we haven't found that to be true. But it's really warm middles and lows for sure.
Well, that's it. I've got my shopping list in order here.
Oh, excellent.
All right, now that we've talked about the drum, let's get to checking out the demo. So what I did was I took the drum over to the other studio here on the other side of this office, big room, fully mic'd up. So 3 mics on the drum, 2 on top, 1 on bottom. I have a 57 and a blue Hummingbird condenser on top and a 57 on the bottom. 3 overheads with Earthworks, Space Pair, and a Mojave tube large diaphragm condenser over top. 2 room mics 20 feet out from the kit. They're ribbon mics. So it's a full-on mic setup that, trying to capture everything that this drum could possibly put out. And I tuned it medium high, no dampening, and then backed it down by a half step until we got to the super low, deep, guttural kind of sound. So here we go. This is the HolloCore Snare drum. I think that drum sounds fantastic. And I should say, I had 4 other drums that are in my collection tuned up identically to do a side-by-side. I had a solid maple, like steam bent maple. I had a stave oak. I had a 12-ply maple and had a vintage style 3-ply mahogany poplar. Just to compare it, like what does this drum, how does it fit with all these drums that I'm really familiar with? It sounded, like I said in the interview, most comparable to the vintage style 3-ply, but just bigger and fuller. And it also had like no sour spots, where some of the other drums, when I was getting into that lower mid tuning, they just kind of, you could tell that wasn't a sweet spot. This thing is kind of like scooped in all the right ways. So if you like that deep, kind of dry, punchy, fat kind of snare sound, but you don't want to use an old vintage drum, check out the HolloCore. It's no joke. But yeah, unfortunately, I've got to box it up. It's sitting down here. I've got to box it up and send it back home. But yeah, contact your local dealer or reach out to Doc Sweeney directly to see where this drum might be available. That's the HolloCore. Super cool.